And our final speaker for the session is Dr. Mary Newport. Dr. Mary Newport actually pioneered what we call the ketogenic diet for Alzheimer's disease. And the talk today is going to be on how natural and man-made trans fats became grouped in dietary guidelines. Dr. Mary Newport.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. And I think most of you are used to me talking about my husband's experience with taking coconut oil, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. Dr. Ralph Martin will talk about Alzheimer's and coconut oil later this afternoon. Instead, I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on for over a year. And one of the reasons I started working on this was because when I was in medical school, I was taught that coconut oil was an artery clogging fat. And so when I started giving my husband coconut oil in 2008, this was a little bit of a dilemma, but when I started learning as much as I could about coconut oil, I learned that it actually has these medium chain fatty acids that were so beneficial to my husband, and many other components and many health benefits, quite the contrary. So with this project, I wanted to try to understand where this idea came from, that coconut oil is something that we should avoid, and that saturated fat is something that we should avoid. And I've been working on this now for about a year, and I could talk about it for 5 hours, and I apologize that I would probably talk about it for at least 45 minutes instead of a half hour. But nevertheless, I will go forward here. So, basically, I want to make a few points up front. If an unproven idea is repeated often enough, it may eventually be accepted as fact. That's something we've learned in the US. If you tell a lie often enough, people will think it is true. And there's one thing we learned from the pandemic, that as science advances, our understanding of nature evolves and has to be updated. And that was true with the virus. At first, we didn't know much about it, but our knowledge of it grew and made it easier for us to try to deal with it over time. But when we talk about the diet and saturated fat and all of that, despite scientific advances in our understanding of how our body works, how fats work in our metabolism, and diet basically works, nutrition policy has stayed very stagnant, and it has clung to this unproven lipid heart hypothesis. So this problem started during the early part of the 20th century, and basically it was considered to be an epidemic, thought to be an epidemic of fatal heart attacks in middle-aged men that became fairly obvious in the 1940s and early 1950s. And what's really happened is that we've traded possibly an epidemic of higher rates of coronary heart disease in middle-aged men for growing epidemics since the 1960s that affect people of all ages, from infants to adults. And these are epidemics of obesity, diabetes and prediabetes, dementia, autism, and other chronic diseases. And these epidemics originated basically around the 1960s in the US and spread globally along with the Western diet. So the research has mainly been focused on diet, much of the research about why there seem to be more heart attacks in middle-aged men. But there were a few other things that were going on. For example, heart disease was the 4th leading cause of death in the US until about 1910. But infections took the top 3 places. And what was going on was that there were public health measures that were being instituted: chlorination of water, pasteurization of milk. The smallpox vaccine came along, and many fewer people were dying from infections, and that bumped heart disease up to the 1st place. Basically, it wasn't that there were more heart attacks and more heart disease at that point in time in 1910. It's just that people were not dying so much of infections at that point. And what happened as a result is that the lifespan in the US greatly increased. It was only 47 years, the average lifespan for people that were born in 1990, but by 1950, the average lifespan increased to 69. And the older you get, the more likely you are to have a heart attack or die from heart disease. So it could be that the numbers were increasing simply because people were living longer. So it became more of an obvious problem that middle-aged men, people who are now living in middle age, were having heart attacks. Industrial and vehicular air pollution were becoming very problematic, especially in big cities, and these are known risk factors for heart disease. Tobacco smoking, which Dr. Josephine mentioned, also skyrocketed during the early part of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and it correlates very closely with the trends in coronary heart disease deaths in the U.S. You can see in the 1970s, that's about the time that the FDA, they started making the public aware that there was a connection between tobacco smoking and lung cancer. People stopped smoking. Many people stopped smoking. Heart disease deaths started falling a few years later, along with lung cancer deaths. So tobacco, and it is now considered to be a major risk factor for heart disease. Another important thing that happened was that our diet shifted very drastically during the 20th century from whole foods to things like refined grains and refined sugar, canned vegetables, hydrogenated shortenings and margarines in place of lard and butter. Processed and ultra-processed foods started appearing on the market and became extremely prevalent, throughout the course of the 20th century. And you can see the slide on the left. The blue are animal fats and oils. These are added fats and oils, so the ones that you would cook with or put like butter on bread or something like that. The orange are animal-based fats and oils. And you can see that at the time that heart attacks were increasing in the U.S. during the early to mid, getting to the mid 20th century, animal fats were actually on a decrease, the availability of them in the U.S. And plant-based vegetable oils and fats were steadily increasing at that time. If you look at the graph on the right, the yellow line is margarine, which was usually hydrogenated at that point, or very often. The blue line at the top is butter. And you can see that there was a dramatic decline in use of butter during that time, and heart attacks were increasing, and a marked increase in margarine consumption during that same time. So it wasn't animal fats that was correlating with these increase in heart disease. So basically, the whole food diet that served humans very well for all of eternity that humans were on Earth shifted from whole foods to processed and ultra-processed foods, many of them containing trans fats. So what's fueling the current epidemics? Basically, you need only to look at the shelves in U.S. grocery stores. This is just a typical neighborhood grocery store in the suburbs. Rows and rows of cold cereals, cookies and crackers, salty snacks, sugary drinks, candy, and there are many other aisles of other ultra-processed foods. And people are going to buy what is on the shelf, so that's what people are eating, and many people in the U.S. only eat this type of foods. They don't bother to go to the produce aisle or much less the seafood area to buy fish. So how do we get to this point? Basically, early in the 20th century, the term solid fat was first used to describe fats that are solid at room temperature, such as lard and butter. Room temperature in the U.S. is about 24 or so degrees centigrade. I know room temperature other places, as Dr. Dyer has reminded me, may not get anywhere close. If you live in the tropics, it probably is not that cold. But so certain fats appear to be solid at room temperature. The term saturated fat wasn't even used until the 1940s. And that's because analytic techniques came along to be able to look at the chemical structure of these fats. And what they decided to name fats, saturated fats that had no double bonds, and they were fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. So everywhere that a hydrogen atom could be in the fatty acid was occupied by a hydrogen atom, and that made it a saturated fat. Hydrogenation was patented around 1902, and with this process, fats are produced from oils that are now solid and semi-solid at room temperature. So these were also solid fats, in addition to the solid fats that, like butter and lard. So basically they became grouped together, natural and hydrogenated fats, simply because they were solid at room temperature. So when a fat is hydrogenated, basically a liquid oil is subjected to high heat, high pressure, and hydrogen is injected. And this changes the unsaturated fats to saturated fats. But the big problem is that also what happens in this process is that double bonds in the unsaturated fats can become distorted. So it basically twists the fatty acid, it kind of straightens it out, it stiffens it. And also double bonds can actually change location in the fatty acids. And both of those things greatly change how those fatty acids behave in our metabolism. So hydrogenation would create more solid fat that was more saturated, and this would prolong the shelf life of these fats because saturated fats are more stable. They tend to be less prone to becoming rancid. And so this allowed food manufacturers to create cheaper shortenings, margarines, and later cooking oils that could, they were much less expensive to produce, and they could compete with lard and butter. So they became very popular during the course of the 20th century. And during hydrogenation, there are at least 14 unnatural fatty acids that are created from these unsaturated fats. And depending on how long this process, the oil is subjected to this hydrogenation process, it can reduce or completely eliminate oleic acid and the essential fatty acids that are in these oils. And when consumed, these abnormal, unnatural fatty acids can cause inflammation and calcification of cells in the arteries, which are known risk factors for coronary heart disease. They can stiffen cell membranes, they can affect what gets in and out of the cell and greatly reduce the life of the cell. So they are potentially very harmful. So natural saturated fats contain no unnatural man-made fatty acids. Hydrogenated fats and oils contain at least 14 unnatural man-made fatty acids that are potentially harmful. Coconut oil is clearly not the problem that causing heart disease increases people dying from heart disease in the US. You can see coconut oil is the black line on the bottom. It was barely 2 to 3% at the most of the oils that were being consumed in the United States throughout the entire 20th century. The green line was cottonseed oil, which is the type of oil that was hydrogenated when Crisco was invented. It came on the market in 1911. And you can see that was there was much more consumption of that than coconut oil. Soybean oil steadily increased. It was often a polyunsaturated oil, liquid oil. It was used as a cooking oil, and you can see that it just took off like a rocket in the 1960s after the American Heart Association came out with their dietary guidelines saying we should eliminate, reduce saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fats. Soybean oil just really took off like a rocket, and consumption is much higher than it had ever been in all of humankind. Saturated fat is not always solid fat. MCT oil is completely liquid at room temperature, and in fact, its melting point is less than 5 degrees centigrade. So you practically have to put it in a freezer to get MCT oil to become solid. Virgin coconut oil at room temperature in the US is a semi-solid, nice white fat. And just a few degrees above that, it's completely liquid and well below body temperature. So it's not a solid fat that might be an artery clogging fat. that's just kind of a misconception. You know, when fats are digested, they're actually taken apart into the fatty acids. We don't have particles of fat that cross it, you know, our intestine and enter our bloodstream and go and clog our arteries. That just isn't what happens. Dr. Dietary talked about the composition of coconut oil, but here's another chart that kind of shows what's going on. The blues are the medium chain fatty acids, and coconut oil is the one on the left there. And the orange and the red on the top of the coconut oil are the long chain fatty acids that are typically found in most vegetable oils. And you can see that the long chain fatty acids are actually a little bit less in coconut oil than they are in the everyday other cooking oils that people use, like corn oil, olive oil, sesame, soybean, sunflower. Palm oil has a fair amount of those longer chain fatty acids, a little bit less than half of the fat. And the only other fat there that has any amount of medium chain triglycerides is butter, which is the fat of cow milk. And human milk also has a substantial amount of medium chain triglycerides, so apparently they're very important to the growing fetus. So I think we already talked a little bit about this, but the American Heart Association came out with their latest advisory on dietary fat and heart disease in 2017. And one of the things they said about coconut oil, one of the things was that clinical trials that compared the direct effects on cardiovascular disease of coconut oil and other dietary oils have not been reported. That's actually not true. There were many studies of dietary fat and the effect on heart disease, and they did not show that dietary fats affect heart disease. We're going to go through some of those a little bit later. They said, however, because coconut oil increases LDL cholesterol, a cause of cardiovascular disease, which is actually disputable, it has no offsetting favorable effects. We advise against the use of coconut oil. So what they chose to ignore, they used studies that were published by Mensick, looking at various types of fatty acids, and Mensick had reported that lauric acid had the greatest effect of any fatty acid of increasing HDL cholesterol, which is called good cholesterol, but they completely ignored that. They decided that that they didn't agree with that. And they also ignored numerous coconut oil studies that report health benefits. So in 2020, the American Heart Association published in their journal a review of 16 coconut oil studies that basically reported that we should avoid coconut oil because it increases LDL cholesterol and has no redeemable qualities as far as benefits. So I decided to look at the data myself. So I got the complete articles, looked at all the data, and basically these were studies of coconut oil where they were comparing coconut oil to one or more other oils. And most of these studies used coconut oil to represent saturated fat in their study. I reviewed all of the 16 studies, and one of them turned out was MCT oil. It wasn't actually coconut oil. There were two other small, short studies that were looked like it was an adulterated, like a coconut oil that was diluted with another oil. It was only 75% saturated fat, and it had more of the longer chain fats than you usually see in an oil. So basically I took the data from those two out because it didn't really look like it was coconut oil. But that left with 16 sets of data of people who were just taking coconut oil, and they had a cholesterol level drawn before they started taking it and at the end of the study, and that left about 525 people. These studies lasted anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 years. And if you look really at the top there, there was really a minuscule change in total cholesterol when you averaged out the data from all of these people, and the same thing with LDL cholesterol. HDL appeared to increase, and this was something that was very consistent. All but one of these 16 sets of data showed that coconut oil actually did increase HDL cholesterol, which was really interesting. But when you break them down into the short-term studies, that's where, it looks like there may be an increase in total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, even though some of those studies, they reported that the average was a decrease in cholesterol levels. It's just when they averaged all of these together, it looked like that on average that people had an increase in their cholesterol. But when you look at the medium length studies, 8 to 15 weeks, and then the long-term studies, 1 to 2 weeks, there was actually very little difference. It looked like total cholesterol actually went down in the medium and even LDL in the medium-term studies, and basically was stable over the long term. So when they say that coconut oil increases cholesterol, I get this question all the time. If I take coconut oil, won't it increase my cholesterol? Well, it can actually increase, decrease, or not change your cholesterol level. Every individual is different, and these studies reported individuals when they usually average a group of people, but some people had increases, decreases, some didn't change. When they would average them, on average, they might increase. So it's not really true to say coconut oil increases your cholesterol. It could go anyway. So getting back to what happened in the 20th century with the diet, in the 1950s, we were at this point, which Dr. Josephine had talked about. President Eisenhower had a heart attack. There was great interest now in doing more research. And some of the earliest research looked at sugar intake and implicated excessive sugar intake, as a possible culprit in heart disease. And this was in a number of animal studies and a few small human studies. Another thing that happened in 1952, the first artificially sweetened beverages came on the market, and this cut pretty deeply into sugar industry profits by like 12 or 13%. So they became very concerned, and in 1954, there's documentation of a speech that was given by the president of the Sugar Research Foundation, in which he identified, this was at an industry conference, a sugar industry conference, he identified a strategic opportunity for the sugar industry that they could increase sugar's market share by getting Americans to eat a lower fat diet. If they could get Americans to eat a low fat diet, they could recapture 20% of the calories in the US diet, which would now be more consumption of sugar, and it would increase their profits again. So, and they did fund studies of dietary fat, trying to point to fat as a culprit. And they even paid substantial money to several doctors at Harvard to put out a large two-part review in which they downplayed the results of the sugar studies and promoted fat as a major culprit in heart disease and promoted a low-fat diet. So the sugar industry had their fingers in all of this. And then Dr. Ansel Keys, before his infamous six-country graph that Dr. Josephine told you before, he published another paper. He actually published a paper in which he said he had basically noticed that the U.S. diet seemed to have increased by 13% in its fat intake since 1910, mainly from the newer hydrogenated salad and cooking oils and fats, margarine and mayonnaise. And he suggested that if we just replace these new fats and oils with more nourishing fats, we might be able to reduce fat intake and possibly reduce heart attacks. But he was talking about hydrogenated fats that have trans fats in them. He was actually onto something, but his research ended up taking a different direction. So going back to the early part of the 20th century, around 1913 and 1960, there were a slew of animal studies. And rabbits were the main animals that were studied. Other animals were studied as well. And they had basically looked at the plaques on arteries, atheromas, and what they were made out of. And one of the things that they could actually see at that time under a microscope were cholesterol crystals. They also identified calcium and other components of these atheromas, but they focused on cholesterol because that's something that people eat in their diet. And they started feeding these little rabbits the equivalent of huge amounts of egg yolks. So If say a rabbit's a little 4-pound, 2-kilo rabbit, that would be equivalent to an average-sized human getting about 9 egg yolks a day. Or they would give them cholesterol equivalent to about 18,000 milligrams today in a human who normally averages about 300 milligrams a day of cholesterol. And what happened was that these rabbits developed yellow streaks on their arteries and massive damage to other organs, their liver, their adrenals, their kidneys, and that type of thing. And so, they basically assumed that eating cholesterol, eating eggs that were high in cholesterol was a problem. The big problem is that rabbits are vegetable eaters. They don't eat animal proteins. They don't eat eggs. And there were researchers that pointed out that the animal proteins might have caused these yellow streaks and damage to the organs. But nonetheless, people like Ansel Keys picked up on those studies. And it happened that also in 1953, he and his wife traveled to several European countries. And they learned about men who were in hospitals. These were wealthy men who had heart attacks. And when they dined with these wealthy men, they seemed to be eating more fat than working class men, and they had higher cholesterol levels on average. I read an article about what foods they were consuming, written by Ansel Keys. They were also consuming pastries and desserts, which were high in sugar, but he kind of ignored that and looked at the fat in their diet. And then he made a presentation and then published this idea in 1953 and showing this graph of 6 countries and showed the higher the percent of fat that was eaten in the country, the greater the heart disease deaths. And as we saw earlier, when there were actually 22 data points, and when these were plotted out by another researcher, they were very random. There was no such relationship. So the lipid heart hypothesis is based on a faulty idea. One of the ideas is that eating too much fat or cholesterol will cause fat and cholesterol to be deposited in arteries and cause a heart attack. It also states that reducing serum cholesterol by changing the fats and cholesterol in the diet will reduce the risk of having a heart attack. So we'll look at the first point. And there have been a number of autopsy studies now that have been done since this idea came along. And that really refute the idea that if you eat more fat or cholesterol, it's going to be deposited in the linings of your arteries. So the fetus in Newport already have atherosclerosis, even though their cholesterol levels are the lowest they will ever be in their lives. And they have found in various studies that the amount of atherosclerosis is the same in people who die from heart attacks and those who don't, in people with high and low serum cholesterol levels, in people that eat high fat and low fat diets, in people that eat high percent of polyunsaturated fat and low percentage of polyunsaturated fat, and in people who take statins and don't take statins. Atherosclerosis, it progresses as you age, and none of these things seem to make much of a difference in regard to how much you have. The other thing that they have found was that within the atheromas, these are the plaques that can occur on the arteries that are so worrisome, that the concentration of cholesterol and other lipids in these plaques and in these areas that have atherosclerosis is the same for people that consume low versus high percentages of polyunsaturated fat. And some of the current thinking is that atherosclerosis appears to be a protective process, a protective mechanism. If you think about it, the heart, it's our first vital sign, first detectable vital sign, and for most of us, our last detectable vital sign. And the heart is a pump that beats basically every second of our lives for years and years and years. Our blood vessels are subjected to pressure every time the heart pumps. And where the arteries, blood vessels branch, these areas can become weakened over time when they're subjected to that much pressure. And the current thinking is that atherosclerosis is a process that helps protect blood vessels from this constant pressure. And atheromas, these plaques, seem to appear as a result of inflammation, infections, other damage to arteries. So it's not as clear cut, it's not a simple thing. You eat more fat or cholesterol, and you're going to have more atherosclerosis and more, plaques on your arteries. So the second part, of the lipid heart hypothesis was that if you reduce cholesterol or total fat or change the type of fat that you're eating, that this could reduce your risk of dying from a heart attack or coronary artery disease. And numerous studies have been done that have refuted that since then. Ansel Keys, he wanted to study this lipid heart hypothesis, and he had access to people who were inpatients in a mental hospital. And he studied men, and all of these men were eating the very same diet every day. So it was relatively easy to compare them, and he would study a high-fat diet versus a low-fat diet. And he would study various types of oils in the diet. And one of the things he said in every one of his papers about these studies was that he found huge variability between individuals and within the same individual from week to week. And the graph over on your right there, those are 14 different men. Each line represents a man in one of his studies where he went from a high-fat diet to a low-fat diet. And you can see, even though they're on the very same hospital diet, some of the men have cholesterol levels that are almost twice as high as some of the other men. And these levels kind of zigzag. The people that had very high cholesterol levels, when they ate the lower fat diet, they did seem to have a substantial drop off in their cholesterol levels. The people that were kind of in the middle there, in the 180 to 280 range, they didn't change all that much. There was a lot of fluctuation from week to week. And Keys would conclude, he would always say in his conclusions, that the average results could not predict what would happen to any individual. You couldn't say when you put somebody on a low-fat diet that their cholesterol level will go down. It just wasn't the case, even in this study. And he also would conclude that the studies had too few subjects and they were too short to be able to prove that a change in dietary fat made a difference in whether someone had a heart attack or not. The studies just weren't long enough. But nonetheless, studies like his and other people that were conducting similar studies became the basis of evidence for what was called prudent diet at the time. So Keys also worked very hard to develop a prediction equation. He would come up with an equation that included polyunsaturated fat and saturated fat. He found monounsaturated fat, which is like olive oil, basically. Didn't really change cholesterol levels either way, so he knocked that out of the equation. And he tried to make several different attempts to come up with an equation, and finally he settled on one. However, even that equation, he found that there were several solid fats that actually didn't increase total cholesterol when they were consumed as predicted by his equation. And those were cocoa butter, beef tallow, lamb, mutton tallow, both animal fats, and hydrogenated coconut oil did not increase cholesterol levels as expected. And he speculated that was because the medium-chain fatty acids in it might possibly explain, why it didn't increase the cholesterol levels quite as much. He said butter, at 5% of total calories, it increased cholesterol levels a tiny bit, and butter was not a problem. Stearic acid is one of the two main saturated fats that are found in natural oils and fats. And he found that stearic acid actually appeared to reduce total cholesterol levels. Cocoa butter has a lot of stearic acid in it, and so do a lot of the animal fats. So nonetheless, even though his equation didn't hold true for all of these solid fats, his equation was used to predict the effects of these fats in study designs for decades. Another thing that he ruled out fairly early on was dietary, consumption of, how much cholesterol you ate in your diet. By 1956, he had already come to the conclusion that eating large amounts of dietary cholesterol had very minimal impact on cholesterol levels. So, and then later he was said to have said it was never the cholesterol. So already in 1956, he said this. And many studies after that also showed that there was no effect of how much cholesterol you ate in your diet. But it took until 2015 for the Dietary Guidelines for American and to 2020 for American Heart Association to finally stop the recommendations to limit how much cholesterol we were eating in our diet. He's also did a study in 1961. He started becoming concerned about hydrogenated fats versus the natural fats, and he did studies in these men that were in the mental hospital, and he looked at hydrogenated versus natural safflower oil and hydrogenated versus natural corn oil, and basically he found that when they ate a substantial quantity of these, that the hydrogenated fat seemed to greatly increase cholesterol levels. I'm way over time? Oh gosh, I will keep going. Okay. So, basically, foods with natural solid fat, lard and butter, and hydrogenated fats with shortening and margarines were not studied separately ever. I'm sorry, I probably have about 15 more minutes, so I don't know what to do. Yeah. Well, okay. But, I just want to try to finish with, basically the American Heart Association came out with a fundraiser and their dietary guidelines in 1957 and 1961 before any large long-term studies had been conducted. And none of these large long-term studies ever showed that reducing cholesterol levels by changing type of fat from saturated fat to polyunsaturated fat had any effect of reducing deaths from heart attacks. So, all of these studies were conducted by 1980 when the first dietary guidelines for Americans came out. And, they nonetheless, even though they did not show that it had any impact on heart disease deaths by lowering cholesterol through changing the fats in the diet, they adopted the prudent diet, the low-fat diet. So I guess that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Mary. That was wonderful. Basically, built on two other speakers' talks. There's a lot of time for discussion, so we can bring it up to discussion.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary. So I'm going to hand over to Mary for the discussion.
Can share your thoughts.
So I practice what I preach. I'm not sure, for those who don't know me, I actually have a YouTube channel. I'm a practicing doctor, I'm a surgeon, but on the side, I really promote health and wellness. So I promote eating natural fats, coconut oil, it's a staple for our family, and every chance I get, whenever there's occasion, whenever there are gatherings, or any opportunity to inform them that eating saturated fats and cholesterol is actually not bad. And to prove to them, I always talk about my mother, who's already 68 years old. with no hypertension, no maintenance medications, and have been better, never been better as compared to 5 years ago before we started this. So it's only around 5 years ago that we actually came to know that eating saturated fats, animal fats, coconut oil is actually healthy than avoiding them. And I think it is something that we should all be aware. And as a doctor, I also preach it to my colleagues, fellow doctors, because as what Dr. Mary said, these were not taught in med school. These were not taught in training. Even now, there are already subspecialties in medicine that are advocating all plant-based. And yes, coconut oil is included, but they also include still seed oils, factory made oils. And that is something that we should really be aware. And so on my day-to-day life, I practice what I preach. You cannot see any seed oil in our pantry, in our family. And whenever we eat outside, we usually ask what oil do they use whenever we order fried foods. To be safe, we usually just consume grilled foods or the ones with soup to make sure that we avoid consuming these seed oils. And we are very, very happy whenever we know like a certain fast food chain in the Philippines is actually using coconut oil for frying. So I think it's also good for anybody, for any one of us, for every opportunity that you have, don't be afraid. Be an ambassador of coconut oil use and natural saturated fat use.
Yeah, the question is asking, in everyday life, how would you promote can you flash the question again? How are you promoting it actually eating saturated fat and cholesterol is good? First of all, when you eat whole food. You don't say, I'm eating saturated fat, I'm eating cholesterol. So, and that really goes to the point which I presented that I think if you if you eat real food and avoid ultra-processed food, you're already you're already doing the right thing. And the second is, as a rule, everything in moderation. So don't overeat anything. And then diversity is always good in terms of food. Although I agree that there are some foods that you should try to avoid. I guess polyunsaturated fat is not bad by themselves, but you shouldn't take too much polyunsaturated fats. And I guess the other rules which are already presented is, as a chemist, you know that polyunsaturated fats are really unstable. That's why when they sell soybean oil, they sell them in amber bottles because they oxidize with light and produce free radicals. So polyunsaturated fats are really unstable. So cooking with polyunsaturated fats, and that includes a lot of fats that are available in shelves. Those things you avoid. So maybe avoid certain things. Avoid ultra-processed foods, at least too much ultra-processed foods, and everything in moderation. And don't worry about, when you eat, you don't say, I'm eating saturated fat, I'm eating cholesterol. It's that. Just don't think of that when you eat.
Yeah, I just have to go along with all of that. I encourage people to get away from these ultra-processed foods and to eat whole foods. And coconut oil, especially virgin coconut oil, is a whole food. So, and people can't figure out, what is 10% of saturated fat in the diet. They would have to look at charts of what the fatty acid composition is, and they just really cannot even calculate that on their own. So it's just really, I tell people with coconut oil, that their cholesterol level could go up or down in state of sun. I talk about these analysis of the studies but I'm usually dealing with very elderly people that have cardiologists that are fighting all the way, and their family practice physicians often too. So it's a real dilemma. But I think their brain is dying if they have Alzheimer's. Are they going to worry so much about their cholesterol level? So.
Thank you, Dr. Grace, Dr. Derek, and Dr. Mary. Here I would like to disclose some secrets about all our three speakers. That Dr. Derek is already 70 years, but I think by his appearance you cannot realize that he's already 70 years. That is the secret reason of his taking this year. And about Dr. Grace, I would like to share that she is into her motherhood and she is 5 months pregnant, but I don't think so by her appearance anybody can recognize that she is 5 months carrying. So what she told that she is already practiced what she preached. So that can be seen very well from her figure and her daily life. And the same about Dr. Mary, she is already 71 years and I think she is also a VCO consumer. And I think we have all the three good speakers who all really practice what they preach. And we have a second question. Doctors in hospitals still talk about dangerous to eat coconut milk. How to solve these problems?
That question is really quite hard because it's going to be a battle between one doctor to another. So as much as I am really against a doctor who is advising against it, I actually avoid that kind of confrontation. I try to make it as an educational kind of conversation wherein I like to ask. I usually educate the patient. I educate the patient and I let them decide for themselves. So I inform them that the medical books we actually study in med school are actually 5 to 10 years behind when it comes to the current data. So if you are a doctor now, the knowledge that you have, based on those studies that you've studied on for exams to pass for your licensure, it's at least 5 to 10 years behind. And if you want to know further, you have to look at data, their own research, and you have to know how to scrutinize research. And I'm so happy that I'm here with Dr. Mary and Dr. Fabian, who are really aware what's a good research quality is like. Because first, you have to know who's funding the research. Because funding will play so much role in that. I don't want to think that we need to fund them as well in order for them to promote the healthy foods. But the truth is, healthy, natural foods actually is not really that profitable. You cannot ask farmers to fund research in order for us to buy meat, to buy eggs, or to grow our own vegetables. That's why, as much as possible, I do my own answer in this kind of problem by educating everyone. And then I empower patients to ask the right questions, because I will not be able to be there whenever they are hospitalized. I will not be able to be there to discuss with their doctors as much as I want to. But what we can do as leaders in this community who are, I feel, is an advantage when it comes to knowing these things, because we are more open-minded, we are more aware that there are so many things playing at the background on what's being popularized. I like the one that you, on your first slide, that even if it's a lie, but if it's repeated many times, it becomes a fact. So maybe we should need to be louder and to be more talkative when it comes to these things, so that everybody will know. And then when, hopefully, if they go to a hospital and they are in a scenario where they have doctors who are advising them to avoid coconut milk, they can just ask, what's your research? Or what's your evidence? And when was it published? Because there are recent data that is, you can actually not see one study supporting that claim. there's no study supporting any claim that consuming coconut milk or natural saturated fat, for that matter, on isolation, without factors that are known to be inflammatory, is causing any problem when it comes to our health. So I would like to address that by making everybody knowledgeable on asking the right questions so that they'll be able to have a more empowered and informed decision. No doctor can also force a patient to eat or drink or take any medicine. We can always just recommend, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the individual, it's going to be the patient who will decide for themselves. So let us help everyone become more knowledgeable.
Yeah, well, aside from thinking about changing my doctor, what I would say is that, do you eat curry? You know, like, half the world eats curry, and curry, the base of curry is coconut meat. So that's one. And then I think many countries have regions where there's high consumption of coconut, and heart attacks are not prevalent, not common in those. In the Philippines, it's well known province of people. India, of course, the Kerala, they eat coconut every 2 hours maybe. And people in the Pacific, you go to an island, all you see are coconut trees, of course, that's what you eat. So just ask them to think about what they're saying, and that's true. Ask them, what's your evidence? And then just tell them from experience, from my observation, people who eat lots of coconut don't die of heart attacks. So, there, thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's a great idea. Ask them what their evidence is, and I say, well, that's what the American Heart Association says to do. But they should provide the actual evidence. And doctors, their time restraints are so large that when they look at studies, they'll often just read the summary. And I encourage them to read the entire article. That's what I've been doing. As I've been, working on this project for the last year. Looking at the actual data, what does it really say? Because sometimes even what the authors conclude might not quite match necessarily with the results that they show if you read through the whole paper. As far as, I think challenging them is really a way to go. That's a great idea.
Thank you. We have another 2 or 3 questions are there. Is there any different the fat in coconut oil compared with coconut milk, and also comparison with palm oil? I think this is a tricky question.
Yeah, well, the coconut oil is squeezed from the meat, and the coconut milk is, there's coconut oil in there, but of course coconut oil is lipid soluble, so the milk wouldn't have as much oil as the meat. Now, how do they compare it palm oil? The fatty acid profiles of coconut and palm oil are quite different. As showed in the tables, the major fatty acid in coconut oil is lauric acid. That's a medium chain fatty acid. Palm oil, from its name, it's palmitic acid. It's 16 carbon fatty acid. But palm oil is also high in oleic acid, which is an 18 carbon monounsaturated fatty acid. In a way, it's actually quite similar to olive oil. So they're two different oils. And they do have different effects. I don't know whether a community has ever lived on palm oil, not like experience observation with coconut, where island communities just consume coconuts and are healthy. So maybe that's as far as I would go with the comparison.
Thank you. Any more questions? In Indonesia, we like to eat the food with deep fry methods. Is it better if we change another vegetable oil with coconut oil with the same methods?
Well, coconut oil, because it's a saturated fat, is really the most stable fat. So, and also if you think about it, and also perhaps not at home, but if you go to a street vendor, they keep reusing the oil. In that case, it's actually can be quite dangerous, because the more you reheat the oil, then the more free radicals and aldehydes you produce. So personally, of course, coconut oil is the safest of all the oils. But I think this Dr. Tan said the healthiest way of preparing food is really by boiling. Because if you boil, you limit the heating temperature to 100 degrees, because that's when water boils. But if you fry, the temperature will go up to 200. So there's a 100 degree difference. And it's not just the oil you're worried about, it's really the food also. Because your proteins will also hydrolyze and those things. But we all love fried food. I love fried food. But if you're gonna fry, just fry with coconut. But otherwise, I think boiling is probably healthier.
If I will add to that, coconut oil, among all oils used for cooking, I think is the safest and also economical. And when it comes to food preferences, because when it comes to heat stability, coconut oil and other saturated fats are heat stable. However, we know not everybody eat pork, so you cannot use lard. Not everybody eat beef, so you cannot use tallow. So coconut, even if you're a vegetarian, even if you are whatever religion you have, you can use coconut oil. And there is a study that even, as what I've shown in the slide a while ago, coconut oil have the least amount of aldehydes generated when heated at 180 degrees Celsius as compared to other seed oils. And there are also data showing that it is somewhat, at least safer, even if you use it as much as 5 times more as compared to other seed oils. So if you cannot avoid deep frying, at least deep fry it with coconut oil. I think that I had an experience before with some family business on deep frying. The problem they have with coconut oil is that it boils a lot, it bubbles a lot. So that's just something that they should consider, or else it will overflow. But otherwise, other than that, there's no problem with, and I think it's better to use coconut oil for deep frying as compared to other oils.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question. To Dr. Mary, what is currently happening in MCT technology? Is there anything new?
The studies have been slowly accumulating. Unfortunately, they're not really huge studies of MCT oil, but one of my favorite oils with the MCT is a high lauric acid MCT oil, and it's available in the U.S. and I think in Asia and Australia. Lauric acid has these benefits of antimicrobial activity, for example, and it's not found in the standard MCT oil, which is just C8 and C10. So I'm seeing, like in the U.S., more and more oils, like several different ones that are high in lauric acid, that are MCT oils. And we were talking a little bit earlier about like doctors and coconut oil and that kind of thing. And one thing, like sometimes when I did hospice for a while, but I also did home health risk assessments when I was traveling a lot and talking to people a lot about their nutrition. And some people would mention that they had memory problems, but some of them also had heart problems. They were on statins, they maybe had heart attacks, they had bypass surgery and that type of thing. and it's very hard to convince them that they should just, believe me and take coconut oil, and I would always tell them to discuss it with their physician. But I would mention, these hyaluronic acid MCT oils, that the heavier fats have been taken out of these oils, and that they might discuss this with their cardiologist, and maybe they'll go along, with this. But there's another kind of interesting ketone product that came along recently that combines C8 with, it's called butanediol. It's a molecule that converts to beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the ketones. It just became available a few months ago, and it actually increases ketone levels very well, sustains them for a number of hours. So it's kind of various things like that are happening with MCT oils. I can't really think of too much else.